Okay, well in this video we're talking about the last parts of financial analysis, and that's solvency and liquidity. I probably should switch those. Liquidity is this idea that our business can cover its current assets with current liabilities, whereas solvency is more long-term. Both of them, though, are addressing this idea of overall debt asset management. Equity is also a part of that. So let's take a closer look at this activity. All right, when we look at this idea of solvency and liquidity, one of the first things that, again, we're going to back up and talk about is that solvency is all assets and liabilities, whereas the current ratio, or current, is more about liquidity. So if you're liquid, you're able to cover your current assets with your current debts. Solvent, you're talking about all your debts. Okay, so when we break into this, we really have to also keep breaking it down. So current assets and current liabilities are kind of the focus of liquidity. And they really need to have a balance. They need to have some relationship. Or another way to look at this whole area is more long-term, which is solvency, and that's total assets and total liabilities have, again, a balanced relationship. Now, equity is not left out. Equity is still part of the discussion. So equity is still a focus. It's just if we know total assets and total liabilities, then we actually know the answer for equity. Okay, so the best way to do this is jump right into this analysis. Let's start off with liquidity. So when we look at liquidity, remember what that is. That's the ability to cover short-term debt with short-term assets. So it's our ability. Now, we would like to be better able, but we may not be. But that's kind of something that depends on the value. So as we go through this, we'll take a look. So really, let's look at an example. The first way to measure liquidity is very simple. It's just called working capital. It's a dollar value. That's what it is. And it's just current assets minus current liabilities. That dollar value always has to be positive. So that's a simple one. All right, let's go to the next one, current ratio. That's more of a ratio, so it gives us a lot more information. Current assets divided by current liabilities. And I'm going to put 2 over 1 because our goal is this should be higher, larger than 2. So the best way to do this is jump right into an example. So if you've got current assets of, let's say, $220,000, current liabilities of $100,000, when you put that into a ratio, you end up with this 220 over 120. It looks like my example is a little bit different. So 220 over 120 is going to be a 1.83 value. So a little bit of a mistake on my values there. But that's a 1.83. So the question, is that any good? Well, the answer is it's not super bad, but it's not a good deal. It's a concern. And so the idea of liquidity is we would like a value greater than 2. But if it's not, how can we fix that? Well, first thing you would want to do is say we need to pay off some of these current debts. However, that'll take down the assets that we have. So that kind of creates a little bit of a problem. So the business needs to try to get rid of current debt by paying it off, but also at the same time build up inventory. So if a business has been selling a lot of inventory and trying to increase liabilities to keep growing, maybe we need to stop that. Another way to do that is to try to look at your cost of production. We need to lower our costs, create more bottom line profit, and use that to pay off these debts. We've also got to be careful we don't move long-term or short-term assets and liabilities into long-term debts, because that would actually just mask the problem. So what's a really focus is we need to operate better operate, I should say, current assets and liabilities. We need to keep that as the focus. Once we do that, then we can move that ratio. All right, so let's move away from liquidity and let's talk about solvency. So solvency is the whole business now. It's kind of hard to come up with a number here because it depends on our business. But first one to look at is a simple ratio. It's called debt to asset ratio. Debt to asset ratio is going to take our total liabilities, debt, and divide it by our total assets. So that creates the ratio. Now it's going to be a decimal value, but it could also be a percent value when it gets reported. So again, the best way to look at an example. If I've got $250,000 of debt and I've got $350,000 worth of assets, then that's a 0.71 or 71% of my assets have a debt, or 71% of my assets, have debt. And so that's kind of sometimes how it's shared. Now, equity is not going to be not talked about. In fact, it's already identified. There's a ratio called equity to asset. Doesn't really get used as much, but it's total equity divided by total assets. So again, that's a decimal or a percent value. And so we're going to be able to look at 0.29 or 29% because we already know the value there. All right, so that's an easy way for us to understand equity to asset. All right, let's move down and let's talk about another value, and that is going to be, well, I'll back up. Equity to asset and debt to asset, we know those numbers because they add together. Assets plus liabilities must equal equity. So if we know the percent of the assets that have debt, we automatically know the percent that have equity because, again, those add to 1. So jumping ahead, sorry about that. All right, so that kind of really finishes a little bit of solvency. Now there's another ratio that is in this group, and it's more about just what do our debts look like. And it's, again, not done as often, but it's called the interest expense ratio. All we do is take total interest expense and divide it by total liabilities. So the example here would be 17.5 in interest expense, but we've got borrowing of $250,000. That is going to be a 0.07, or we move the decimal on this for sure. So that's a 7% average debt. Now, that's not a high number in today's market, but really kind of the goal for this is to, of course, keep it lower. That's the idea. That the lower, the better. Now, if it's not lower, then that does kind of throw some signals because that would let us know that we may be a high-risk business. So when you calculate interest expense ratio, it's a little bit about what is the average borrowing rate. And then if that's high, then is the business in some sort of a risk factor that is creating the high rate of interest, because that's what interest is based on. So that's kind of what we're learning when we do this ratio.